Two Pennsylvanians in this picture. Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, seated. That's Paul Webb, VMI class of 1951. There are a lot of photos of Marshall Day. Now, this is the day they dedicated the arch to General Marshall. But this is my favorite. In all the other photos, he's surrounded by crowds and cadets. But I like this. He's seated, reflective, almost lonely, I think. This is not far from the base of Moses Ezekiel's statue of Virginia mourning her dead, as repositioned on Letcher Avenue in 1912. The official biographer of George Marshall, Forrest Pogue, describes this moment as inconsequential. That it's a pleasant distraction from the ordeals of service as the Secretary of Defense. I think this is really important. And I want to talk with you a little bit about that tonight. I promised Paul I wouldn't talk for more than 6 hours. We might have had a breakfast bar. We just go all night and bring your pajamas. But before I launch into this story, I want to offer you all a sincere expression of my gratitude, humility, and appreciation. As Paul mentioned, I served for 2 years as a cadet assistant at the George C. Marshall Foundation and survived. He said I successfully completed. I think I just survived. A very rigorous Marshall undergraduate scholars experience here at VMI. And I was talking to my friend, Bill Percival. He's the cadet with the proper haircut. Not go? General Williams, this would not go today, right? I was talking to Bill, and Bill recently retired U.S. Air Force colonel, living out in Albuquerque. And he told me on the phone recently that the Marshall Scholars Project was so important to him as an Air Force officer, right? Because he learned how to be a serious student. And he went on to tell me about how what he learned as part of the Marshall Scholars Program affected the way he approached every problem he encountered, right, as a U.S. Air Force officer. The professional and scholarly development that I enjoyed in relationship with, associated with the Marshall Foundation, gave me a competitive advantage in graduate school and beyond. But more importantly, I'll have to say that I don't think I would have graduated from VMI without the love and the support and the encouragement and the friendship of the Marshall Foundation community. I know Tom Camden is here tonight. Kept me sane. There you go. Joellen Bland, Larry Bland's wife, is here. Her husband was just extraordinarily influential in my life. Lee McFadden. I don't know if Alice Lee is actually in the room right now, but I think she's here. I mean, y'all saved me. Couldn't get me to get a haircut, but you all saved me. And so I just wanted to let you know. So 27 years after this photo was taken on the steps of the Marshall Foundation, and I'm back here giving an invited lecture. I mean, this is just awesome. So thank you so much, and just know how very much I appreciate this moment on a personal level. So I graduated from VMI somehow. Earned a doctorate in history, and then went to work for the government. And in 2012, I had some friends in the VMI community, I see Turk McCluskey there, who convinced me that it would be a great idea for me to come back to Lexington and work at my undergraduate alma mater, right? And so to serve as a professor in the Department of History and the director of the John Adams Center for Military History and Strategic Analysis, which is a bit of a work in progress, convinced me that it was a great idea to come back. And I jumped at the opportunity to do that, to be sure. And so early in my time here as a VMI professor, I was walking across the campus of the Virginia Military Institute, my undergraduate alma mater, and I realized I didn't know very much about the history of VMI. I was a VMI graduate, I had a terminal degree in history, right? I was a professional historian, right? I paid car insurance, mortgage with money I earned as a professional historian. And I was a professor of history at VMI, and I didn't know very much about the history of VMI. So I was walking across the campus, not actually far from where George Marshall is in this photograph here, sort of coming down the side of the parade grounds on Letcher Avenue there. and resolved to do what historians do, right? Historians are sort of generally curious people, and not knowing much about the history, I decided to do some research. Amazingly, that was 9 years ago. This has been a 9-year journey. But do some research on the history of the Virginia Military Institute, and being familiar and acquainted with the Marshall Library. Of course, I started there, focusing a bit on sort of Marshall and VMI. I branched out to the Preston Library collections, and then to repositories far beyond. But trying to understand or come to terms with the history of the Institute and, to some degree, the central question in the beginning, which was related to Marshall's impact, if any, on VMI. Like, what did Marshall, George C. Marshall, contribute to VMI? Like, that was one of my early questions. Now, we all know what Marshall receives from VMI. Right, so open and read any standard biography of George C. Marshall, and there's a chapter at the front of the book in which they're going to tell you that he learned discipline and self-control and character in his military bearing as a cadet at VMI. Okay? That's what he told Forrest Pogue in an oral history interview. I think this is Forrest Pogue's knee here, in March of 1957. What I learned most at the VMI was self-control, discipline, so that it was grounded in the problems of managing men. But what did Marshall contribute? And as I worked my way through this question, again, here on post and then later beyond, I found sort of an intellectual structure or framework, right, that helped me interpret the documents, right? In the history of higher education, in sort of Southern history, that is sort of the body of scholarship associated with history of the South, and to some degree in this sort of field of memory studies. And I'm thinking here in particular about like John Thielen's work. He's a professor of the history of higher education at the University of Kentucky. And he writes about like organizational saga at American colleges and universities. And how institutions are heirs to a story, and that story sort of defines their personality in the present. Memory studies people spend a lot of time working on nation states and the way nation states sort of use the past to shore up their legitimacy in the present, right? Well, so too do colleges and universities. I found this to be fascinating. Southern historians tell us, right, that white Southerners in particular sort of used the past to try to explain how they are apart or different than the nation. Right? It's pretty interesting stuff. What I was seeing in the documents, though, conflicted with that. Or, I guess more precisely, that the story sort of Marshall and VMI was demonstrating to me the way in which Marshall and VMI were not apart from the nation, but part of the nation. And I'll explain this, I guess, in a little more depth here as we go forward. But all of this sort of resulted in sort of this sprawling sort of book project in progress called Marshall and Mccullough, War and Memory of VMI. Right? And so this is the story of two VMI graduates in World War II. General George C. Marshall, right, commanding general of U.S. Army ground and air forces, right, trusted military advisor to heads of state, including the President of the United States, right, the principal proponent, principal architect of the direct approach to the European war, right, the cross-channel invasion, the organizer of victory, right. This is a photo in Normandy on June 12th, 1944. So he was in D.C. when the landings began on June 6th, and goes to England and comes over for one day on June 12th. So they've landed at Omaha Beach. They're actually trying to get to Utah Beach, but cannot get there because on the road ahead of them is a firefight in that firefight is William Mccullough. Right? So William Mccullough is a VMI graduate, class of 1941. Lands at Utah as a company or troop commander of mechanized cavalry, right? And is fighting at Katz, about 6 miles down the road here, to secure what is the left flank of the 101st Airborne Division's fight for Carrollton at that very moment. So Omar Bradley's with them, and this convoy takes Marshall. They go back to the headquarters, and they shuffle him back to Portsmouth because they're worried he's going to get hurt. So this book is the story. This is a moment. But this book is the story of these 2 VMI graduates in World War II. And the thesis, or the punchline here, I'll sort of tease this out as we go forward, right, is that the accomplishments of these 2 former cadets and others, right, during World War II, and the celebration of their achievements and accomplishments during the post-war period transformed VMI from a Southern military institution into a national commodity. As Paul mentioned, I teach a course on George Marshall and the American Century here at VMI. And there are 2 things that are really clear when I sit around with cadets and we read sort of documents from Marshall's childhood and Marshall's cadetship. Right? The first is that Marshall is very much out of step with the school's Confederate past. Right? And that's clear from the beginning. And he's also an anomaly, right? Because he wants to be a professional soldier at a time when VMI did not produce professional soldiers, right? So Marshall is, in a VMI context, he comes in 1897, graduates class in 1901. He is the anomaly. He is the thing that is different from what is standard, what is normal, or what is expected, right? VMI during this period, right, is a small, right, Southern military school, right, focused on educating students for civil life in a military setting, right? VMI is not West Point. Marshall remembers that the VMI in my day was a pretty stern affair. Pretty Spartan, pretty stern, to be sure. The missions were based on character. There's actually no application to go to VMI. Very backwards-looking institution, limited academic offerings, to be sure, right? And no pathway to getting a commission in the U.S. Armed Forces or the U.S. Army. So why would he go to VMI? You all know the answer to this question, right? He goes to VMI to spite his brother, right? And he can't get into West Point. Pogue asks him a great question, right? In one of the oral history interviews in the 50s, he asked him the question about sort of the professors, the academic sort of component of this. And he asked General Marshall, you know, who were the faculty, who were the professors that you had at VMI that had an impact on your development? And, you know, Marshall, like, you know, will not go on record criticizing anybody, right? So do you know what his answer to that question is? I won't answer the question. He doesn't answer the question, though he goes on to say that Ed Nichols, who later becomes the superintendent, right, and became a very good friend of his, and was warm and supportive of him through his professional life after graduation. Marshall, there's so many stories, and to be sure, I could go for 6 hours here, so I'll try to be sort of selective. We can maybe dig into some of this during the question and answer session. Marshall didn't like Scott Shipp very much. Marshall sees Smith as a bit of an authoritarian figure, sort of stern and abrasive. Marshall is not a good student. Marshall is, and to be sure, sort of struggles in the classroom. He graduates eventually sort of in the middle of the class, but does thrive with the military component of the school. As for the organizational saga, sort of Cadet Marshall's VMI, It is utterly and totally dominated by the lost cause. Right? And so the lost cause is a narrative that white Southerners invent after the American Civil War to explain the catastrophe, right, that had fallen on the South. Okay. And at VMI, this story, this is, of course, George Marshall and John Pershing. I'll get to this. This is in 1920. And so Marshall, okay, and so at VMI there's a very sort of unique, sort of localized version of this legend of the lost cause. In 1864, the Union Army came through. They took the statue of George Washington. VMI managed to secure the statue again in 1866, and it's rededicated, right, in the spot where it currently exists. So some of you may know this. So the keynote speaker that day was John Letcher. Letcher Avenue is named after him. This is the wartime governor of Virginia, who was from Lexington, Virginia. And so John Letcher lays down the story of the lost cause for this community in his speech that day in 1866. And what does he say? Right? This Civil War wasn't about slavery. Right? The Civil War was forced on us by bankers in Massachusetts. Right? No people have ever fought so heroically for a just cause, right, as Southerners did. And oh, by the way, we lost because we just got overwhelmed. Okay. VMI that same year sort of instinctively sort of embeds the Newmarket cadets in those stories. So Scott Schitt, who's the superintendent during Marshall's cadetship, right, was the commandant of the Corps cadets during the Civil War. And he commanded the Corps cadets at the Battle of Newmarket. So in 1866, the same year the Washington statue comes back, right, and Letcher sort of tells the story, Scott Schitt actually goes to Newmarket to recover remains of the boys, some of these boys, and bring them back to VMI. And they're buried in a cemetery, right, which was essentially a cadet cemetery, which is essentially on the spot where the Marshall Foundation is today, right? And so these noble and heroic youth sort of get tagged right inside of this sort of VMI version of the lost cause, right? It's a little bit later in the 1880s, right, that for the first, that this whole, this is like interpreting or historical text, this term sort of exceptional honor, right? VMI had the exceptional honor of fighting as a school, the entire student body in the battle, right? And then that gets translated. I don't know what exceptional honor actually meant in the context of that statement, but that then gets translated into, over time, VMI was the only school in the history of the world that ever fought in a battle on its own. This is not true, right? But it's absolutely germane and fundamental to the saga of the school that George C. Marshall attends. Marshall comes in contact with this story of the lost cause very early. And if you're to believe that, he tells us, right, that he was here in Lexington, right, for the dedication of the Jackson Monument in the cemetery, right? So Marshall grows up on the front lines of industrialization in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. His dad makes a bunch of money, right? And then his father then starts investing in real estate in the Valley of Virginia. Okay. Marshall's brother comes to VMI. In 1891, Marshall claims that he's in the valley with his dad, and they attended the dedication of the statue in the cemetery. 25,000 people, according to some accounts, attended the event, right? The keynote speaker that day was Jubal Early. For real. Marshall remembers this about Jubal Early. So this is a 9-10-year-old boy. His first encounter with Lexington. I don't even know that he had been here before, right? And his older brother's a cadet. And he writes that this speech, this is Jubal Early's speech, the dedication of the statue, was almost treason in its enthusiasm for the Confederacy and its condemnation of the North. He goes on to say the whole thing was very intense in Lexington in those days, right? And Marshall knows this. And Marshall knows this, right? And in some levels, accepts it by marrying Lily Cole. Right? So he marries like a prominent girl from Lexington. And is utterly and totally sort of entwined, right, with the leading families of Lexington. I'm sure he knew the Andersons. I'm sure he must have. Marshall's contesting this in his own way, like almost from the beginning, right? Right? So, on a happy note, so Marshall, for instance, like is ready to quit the army, right? And by 1915, he's done. And he writes at Nichols, who was his professor that he had grown close to, that he's ready to quit the army. He just needs economic conditions to improve, business conditions, so he has some likelihood of finding a good job. But he just needs the courage to sort of step out of the military system and into the business world, right? Nichols writes him back and says, don't. Like some really interesting sort of correspondence between the two. Advises Marshall to stay in the army. Marshall agrees to do that. Ends up going to Europe in World War I and rises to prominence as a member of John Pershing's staff. Marshall's really proud of VMI, right? And convinces Nichols, at this point is the superintendent, convinces John Pershing to come to Lexington to be the graduation speaker in June of 1920. Right? The VMI part of that went really well, right? But then Marshall, with all of his connections here in the community, ends up allowing John Pershing. So this is the commander of the American Expeditionary Force. This is like a rock star, right? I mean, international fame. This is going to be the next president of the United States. He allows Pershing to get sort of sucked into Washington and Lee. And once they get sucked into going to see Robert E. Lee, then all of a sudden, they're going to make a visit to the Jackson site, right? And so Pershing delivers polite remarks, both at favorable remarks about both Lee and Jackson. This is in 1920. It blows up on Pershing. So the narrative's always contested, right? So this blows up on Pershing. Marshall tells us that so Marshall's on his staff, received quite a clamor, right, from certain men in Chicago and others who objected to Pershing going to where Lee was buried and into the Jackson Cemetery. Pershing apparently then went to Marshall and, quote, said, "You got me to go there." But this picture appeared in northern newspapers.
Wow.
Says Pershing told Marshall, "You got me to go there. Now you attend to all the letters objecting to me having gone." So he made Marshall write all these people back in apology. Marshall, of course, is back down in Lexington a few weeks after the trip, right? And with his wife and friends and family, and that's when he writes the letter to Pershing and say, "Oh, by the way, you made an awesome impression on all these people," which means a lot. There's a hilarious story of Marshall. When they're driving down the valley, Marshall wants to show them the Newmarket battlefield. And of course, the Newmarket battlefield is his private property, and they get lost. I mean, these encounters with various farmers in the Valley of Virginia, and their reaction to Pershing is just fascinating. They're not terribly interested in some American commander from Europe, right? As you might imagine. Narratives are always contested. Marshall, I guess, in his own way, is trying to contest the narrative by bringing a prominent national figure to VMI. Right? And Marshall, he's doing other things, and other things are happening during this period that are chipping away at this story of sort of this lost cause narrative in Lexington. A hugely important thing, of course, was the coming of ROTC during the 1920s. It's authorized in 1916, then gets canceled during World War I, and then reauthorized in 1920. And now suddenly there's a way to get a reserve commission in the United States Army. Right? And Nichols, who was the superintendent during that period, claims that this was the worst thing he ever did as the superintendent of VMI. Right? Because they allowed the United States Army to come in and take over the military training of VMI cadets. Right? But there's this gradual sort of erosion of the story. Or not. Marshall's first time as a headliner down here is in 1929. right? So he, after his first wife passes away, he's down at Fort Benning. He comes up, and his first time here as a headliner is to deliver remarks at ROTC commissioning ceremony in 1929. But VMI does remain a thoroughly Southern institution. The famous, I mean, you see sort of framed all around the post. There's the sort of cover for the 1839 Saturday Evening Post coverage. Like, anybody actually read the article? The description of the ratlines is fascinating. This is from 1939. Talking about when they leave barracks by Washington Arch, they must salute Washington. Not allowed to leave by Washington Arch anymore. By Jackson Arch, they have to salute Stonewall Jackson. They must run, this is a description of the rat experience in the Saturday Evening Post. They must run up or down the barracks steps, right, walking from one part of barracks to another. They must always take the outside course, make every turn at a right angle, because the rat line is the longest distance between 2 points. They must sound off their names and addresses when ordered, and sign their laundry list to the tune of Dixie. Remember I mentioned Captain Mccullough, mechanized cavalry officer? This is Cadet Mccullough. In the 1930s, working on the cadet newspaper staff, that was really important. And it was really important because of the nature of sort of the information environment in the 1930s. People started having radios in the 1930s. But the newspaper editor and the newspaper staff at VMI are very important historically. And so in the spring of every year, the outgoing newspaper sort of folks, other institute officials, select leadership for the coming year. And so as a second classman, spring of 1940, right, William Sayers Mccullough, right, a graduate of John Marshall High School in Richmond, Virginia, is elected to be the editor of the cadet newspaper. And so their task, the new staff has a task, they're to put together the finals issue, right, of the newspaper, right, under the supervision of the outgoing first-class cadets. So they know they're ready to go when the new academic session starts. The McCulloughs got an assignment. Marshall has agreed to be the keynote speaker, commencement speaker, for the class of 1940. Right? So what does the kid do? Write a letter to the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, right? In which Mccullough says, in short, I know you're really busy. It's like the fall of France. I mean, this is what Marshall describes the most difficult phase of his professional life, being from 1939 to Pearl Harbor, 1941. That was the most difficult sequence in his life. Right? So this kid writes a letter to George C. Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, that I know you're really busy. We're all really proud of you. Be my graduate. Can you send me a copy of your speech? Well, if you can read this letter. This is Marshall's response to Cadet William S. Mccullough. Dear Mr. Mccullough, I've just at this moment received your note of May 26 requesting me to send you an outline of the talk I am to make before the graduating class on June 12th. Very good. Confidentially and very frankly, up to the present instance, I've had no time to prepare an address, and I'm faced with the necessity of talking informally, as of the moment, unless the pressure lets up here. So he's talking about the defense preparedness stuff. He goes on to say that I'm unwilling to farm out to some other person the task of preparing what I might say. But if I do succeed in finding a few minutes in which to make formal preparation for the occasion, I will very, very happily send you the response. So he can print it in the newspaper. So the finals issue, they actually hand it out at finals. So he wants a copy of the speech to be printed by the time Marshall actually delivers the address. This is responsive. This tells us just this letter. We can spend an hour on this letter, this exchange. Right? Marshall's responsive, right? He's warm, he's transparent, he's honest, And VMI is clearly important to him. Like, this is too important for me to have a staff member gin up something for me to say. Right? This is my speech at my school. And if I come up with something, I'll let you know. Otherwise, I'll talk informally. Right? I would read to you all of Marshall's speech that day that he delivers to the graduating class. He begins by acknowledging that he didn't do anything to prepare for the talk. Then he reminisces a little bit about his graduation day. He was worried about getting a commission. He was going to graduate, and then I'll resist. But he was going to graduate and then maybe do what? He wanted to get married, but there were new officer billets available. So Marshall would not have gotten a commission in the United States Army, right? If not for the Spanish-American War and the fierce nature of Filipino resistance to U.S. occupation. So because of the Philippine-American War, Congress authorized all these new officer billets, right? And so there was a series of competitive exams that were available to Marshall sort of in 1902, right, that he could take to try to earn a spot in the Army as a citizen of the Republic, right? So Marshall's remembering his graduation. He wants to get married, and he wants to figure out how to get a commission because he really wants to be in the Army, but he doesn't know how to get there, but he has to get a commission before he can get married because her family says he has to have a job. Like, it's real stuff. Right? So he reminisces about this for a few minutes, and then you know what he says? He says, the Corps cadets at VMI are a comfort to me. Why are you a comfort to me? Because you prepared, by way of the nature of the system. And because you are part of the body of the nation. That's what he says to them. Like, you're not here to serve Virginia. You're not here to serve the Old South. You're here to serve the United States. Right? It's the theme he's going to hammer this thing over and over again. This is from Homecoming 1948, the dedication of the plaques listing the names of the World War II dead outside Washington Arch. On the other side of the street, of course, is the Washington statue. I've taken cadets who read Letcher's speech, and then you walk over here and you read Withers Burris's speech. Whoa, that's not the same school. Burris would be my graduate. He was coming out of cadets in the late 1930s, had the 100th Division in Europe during World War II. VMI largely ceased to exist as a four-year state college during World War II. Right? What happens after the war is just remarkable. Right? I mean, there is this total transformation, this very sort of rapid transformation or change in the school. Right? The rapid improvement and reinvestment in physical infrastructure here. The dramatic growth, I mean, to include the extension and expansion of barracks, the VMI barracks, were sort of Marshall arches. The sort of Marshall wing, we always called it new barracks. The expansion of the Corps cadets, the wholesale transformation of the demographics of the Corps cadets, right? So when Marshall graduated from VMI, in his class, he was the only graduate in the class who didn't come from an antebellum slave state, right? The class of 1950, right, ex-Virginia, had more graduates from Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey than all of the antebellum slave states combined, right? And nearly a cadet from every state in the Union. There's a renaissance in the academic program, right? I mean, huge infusion of money, of course, through the GI Bill. The professionalization of the VMI faculty, right? It is a stunning and rapid transformation or change in the school. It changes the storyline. They're the victors, right? Marshall, Mccullough, the other former VMI cadets are triumphant. Right? They're the victors in the largest war in the history of the world. Right? And they are no longer, and I will just plainly state this, these noble but heroic losers. Right? They are triumphant, and they are confident, and they retell the story. Marshall comes in, so Marshall engages VMI sort of after 1945 in really sort of constructive ways, to be sure. Okay. But ways that are consistent with with his personality, to be sure, and ways that are consistent with his time and energy and talent. So remember, he's serving as Secretary of State, or he's got the China mission, then Secretary of State, and then he's the head of the Red Cross, and then Secretary of Defense. So he does what he can. Now, to be sure, I mean, he resists the really hard press of 1945 and come back as the superintendent. That would have been really interesting. But he refused that. He did agree to serve on the Board of Visitors, and he did briefly serve as the president of the VMI Foundation. I think a really careful reading of Board of Visitors and VMI Foundation records shows me that he wasn't terribly involved in much of this. But he was available, right? He was consistent and he was supportive, like as he could be. This is Secretary of State George C. Marshall here at VMI in June of 1947. He came down for a BOV meeting and made himself available to the Corps cadets. In that, he made himself available to a group of reporters from the cadet newspaper. And they start quizzing him through all these sort of interesting questions. But one of the reporters asked him, Secretary of State Marshall, there are all these new academic offerings. What do you think, right, that we need to study here at VMI? Right? And Marshall, like, he's really smart, right? He knows it's a trap. Like, it's a trap. So, if he says, oh, Department A is doing something amazing, and the people in Department B are going to be upset, right? If he says C is really useful, then, so he knows this is a trap. And he said something to the effect, the opening of this sort of response is, that's a really important question. I would really need some time to reflect and think about that before I can answer the question. But, he goes on to say, I will say that it's apparent to me that a wide knowledge of history is pretty important. It's timeless events for cadets. Timeless advice, I think, for cadets, even to this day. But the most important thing Marshall did after World War II, right, was allow himself to be placed at the center of the remaking of the VMI story. Right? And the remodeling or remaking, retelling of the organizational saga of this school. He is sincerely humble person. And I think this made him, to be sure, at points rather uncomfortable, right? But it has been sort of, after all, sort of the nature of the argument or the story that he's been trying to tell, like from the very beginning, like one of national service over sort of regional affiliation or loyalty. He sends, they send truckloads of memorabilia down to VMI. It becomes the core of the museum collection of the foundation. I think he was almost embarrassed by how much stuff that they had accumulated that they gave to VMI. And VMI was delighted to have it. They remake the VMI museum at that point was over in Preston Library. It was the front room of they remake the entire museum with Marshall memorabilia and World War II memorabilia, right? Because the museum curator explains to us, right, they want cadets and visitors to have contact with tangible evidence of greatness. That is George C. Marshall, right? He allows VMI to dedicate a art chapter. I don't think he would have really liked the statue. But that doesn't go up until the 1970s. So they didn't need his approval for that. He went along with the dedication of the arch. And I think he was overwhelmed. I mean, it's sort of the reflective photo that we started with, right? They're a bit overwhelmed with it. They teed it up and lined it up with the 50th anniversary of the class of reunion of the class of 1901. The keynote speaker that day, the entire day was loaded with stuff for us to work with as historians. The keynote speaker that day was Bernard Baruch, the South Carolina industrialist. And Baruch talks about Marshall quite a bit. Baruch's dad was a Confederate surgeon, I think, in the Valley during the Civil War, but describes Marshall quite simply. George C. Marshall, according to the keynote speaker, right, is the symbol, right, of a new union of Americans poised for global leadership in this Cold War against the Soviet Union, right? 10,000 people they're here for the dedication of the arch. The foundation is a part of this. This at a time, and I'll give you one little sort of right, where VMI is like purposefully not telling the Civil War story. I'll give you an example of that. Greenlee Letcher, who Marshall actually knows quite well, after World War II, wants to come and remake the Stonewall Jackson classroom in barracks. And they want to make it into a shrine to Stonewall Jackson. There's quite a bit of sort of material on this sort of conversation. VMI, should we do it? Should we not do it? Greenlee's going to pay for it. You know what VMI eventually does? The Board of Visitors? They turn them down. A. Willis Robertson, also from Lexington, was a United States Senator in this period on the Board of Visitors, just hits it right on the nail in his writing about Greenlee's proposal. Says, we don't want to remake this classroom because nobody cares about the Civil War. That's what he said. Right? So there is a sort of conscious, so there is a radical transformation occurring here in the aftermath of World War II. And the Marshall Foundation is very much part of the story. Is very much part of the story. Like the origins of the Marshall Foundation, look, I think we probably know. There's the standard sort of explanation, right? So in September 1951, the President of the United States, Harry S. Truman, sends for the superintendent of VMI. Superintendent of VMI goes to the White House, in which the President proposes that VMI take the lead in creating a dedicated, sort of independent, nonprofit organization to preserve and perpetuate the legacy of George C. Marshall. Right? VMI comes back, early 1953, they charter the George C. Marshall Foundation, and then we go from there. Right? That's the standard story, right? That's not exactly true. I spent a week at the Truman Library trying to figure this out, right? Harry Truman did not want the George C. Marshall papers to come to Lexington. Harry Truman wanted papers to go to the Truman Presidential Library. The federal records that should be part of the National Archives system. Joseph Short, White House press secretary, VMI class of 1925, wanted the papers to go to VMI. Short convinced Truman that this was a great idea. Right? Short is the person sort of behind the scenes that is making this happen. And why does Short want the papers to come to VMI? He wants them to come to VMI because he wants to see this Marshall story inside the heart of the alma mater. Right? This story of national service, right? Of ethical leadership, right? Of duty, of character. Like he wants to embed that inside of VMI. Right? And the way they're going to do that is by bringing the papers. Like most of what's over there, the Marshall class, should be part of Record Book 330 up at the National Archives. But it's not, it's here. Right? Truman again wanted it for the Presidential Library out in Missouri. But it comes here, and it's part of a conscious effort on the part, right, of certain VMI people, right, to drive this story into the ground. I will say there were some objections to all this in an effort to try to always entertain. I mean, just to share it with you, sort of two lines of opposition, both connected, in this case, with the dedication of the Marshall Arch. There were people that did not like this. One line of reasoning, so you have to remember how controversial George Marshall was at this point, right? So Marshall comes to this day, right, literally comes to Lexington, having, like, from Capitol Hill, having testified the first witness for the administration, explaining the relief of Douglas MacArthur in Korea. Right? He's the first expert witness that what Truman White House sends over. Right? And so Marshall has been, at this point, the subject of really intense attacks from a certain sort of wing, the McCarthy wing of the Republican Party, right? So there are people in VMI and beyond who object to VMI naming an arch after George C. Marshall. And there's some hilarious stuff in there, right? If you really, I'm paraphrasing there, if you really want an arch to an American hero, why don't you get the Douglas MacArthur arch, right? Stuff like that. The other objection to this is doing it on Newmarket Day, right? The desecration of the memory of, the celebration of the Newmarket youth. And just some folks that find that unpalatable, to be sure. To my knowledge, nobody objected to the George C. Marshall Foundation. Maybe it's too subtle and sophisticated to attract that type of attention. And the work of the foundation today, in terms of this sort of remaking of the VMI saga, the organizational narrative, is important there as ever. The World War II, I mean, and just shatters the lost cause story here at VMI. Absolutely shatters. And it replaces that saga, that story, with a story of national service. It's the Marshall story, right? And to be sure, like, what comes sort of after this book project ends with Marshall's funeral in 1959, what comes after is not always easy, right? And it's not always linear. But this transformation of the organizational saga, right, affects the way the institution is able to respond to the opportunities and challenges that come up in the second half of the 20th century. And I think is essential to sort of understanding this sort of amazing sort of surge forward into the 21st century as, a vibrant, dynamic, almost global educational institution. The work of the foundation is critical in doing this. This is a photo from a few years, actually right before the pandemic, with Mark Stoller. But the work of the foundation remains sort of essential to the telling of this story here at VMI. It's an essential resource for the public. It's an essential resource for scholars and for our students. And so for that reason, just know how incredibly grateful I am